All right, here we go. Well, let's get this thing going. Today I'm talking about so many things, and before we get into those things, I'm just going to talk a little bit about these live videos that I'm doing every week. It's now my 8th week doing so, and I still haven't figured out this software to the point where I feel proficient with it. Not to mention my hardware, I've been switching up to kind of get better at this as well. So for today, at least, I'm not using my normal microphone, so hopefully this sounds good. I've really been struggling with the audio and the video syncing up together. So if you know anything about this kind of thing, reach out to me. I would love some advice. I think I'm trying to figure this thing out. So yeah, reach out to me if you know something about that. But hopefully for next week, I can get it all dialed in and refined to the point where it actually does what I want it to do. But anyway, thank you for hopping on, whether you're watching live or you're watching after the fact. Drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from and what kind of questions you might have. And today's topic is kind of one that's a big one. I get a lot of people that reach out to me every day. And as people reach out, they're constantly concerned about the big things, the big talking points that we so often talk about here in Utah in terms of things that are concerning to us. And so this is one of those things that there's a lot of fear around, and that's the Great Salt Lake. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Great Salt Lake and really in depth talk about why it's so important to our way of life here. And it's even crucial to us even being able to exist here to begin with. So it's pretty cool. So if you have any comments or questions, drop them in the comments. I'd love to interact and I'll share those answers and keep the conversation going. So first, let me share my screen first and foremost. And I've got a little time-lapse video here queued up that really best shows what is happening to the Great Salt Lake. And as I let this play in the background, you can see how much it's changed over the years. From the 80s up to today, it's shrunk by almost 70% in land area, which is absolutely mind-boggling because this is all during my lifetime. I was born in 1978, and I remember when I was 10 years old going to see the Great Salt Lake because it was flooding, and the governor of Utah at the time, Norm Banketer, had ordered a bunch of massive pumps, industrial pumps, to pump the water out of the lake into the West Desert to really, preserve the places that were being flooded. And that's just in my short lifetime. And as you can see, ever since the mid 80s, this lake has been shrinking up dramatically, and it really impacts our way of life here in Utah and along the Wasatch Front. And when I look at 1986 as kind of the marker year, because that was right after record snowfall in 1983 and 1984 in Utah, where we saw a lot of flooding throughout the state, including in downtown Salt Lake City, which quite honestly turned into a river. If you look at the videos and footage from before, I'll cue this up and play it a couple more times. But just in that short lifetime of mine, I've seen this lake just continually dry up. So the question is why? Is it because the planet's getting warmer? Is it global warming? I personally don't think so at all. You might share a different belief. For me, it's diversion. It's water's being diverted for other things and for more people and for more agricultural use as well. And for that reason, we just haven't been good stewards of the water resources that we have, that we almost have taken on and adopted this mentality that if water makes its way to the Great Salt Lake, it's really kind of just wasted water. And I think that's a terrible mindset. And it's, in my opinion, what's gotten us to this point. Here we are in 2025, and the lake has been at critical levels for the last handful of years. For me, as I look back and I look at the time when I was a kid and the lake was too full and it was flooding, I ask, why did we let this happen? And what it boils down to is in 1986, Utah had less than 1.5 million residents. And today we have over 3.5 million. And since 2010, Utah has been the fastest growing state in the entire country. And with that increase in population, it's drawn a lot of the resources from what would normally have made it its way to the Great Salt Lake. But that's not the full story. The full story here is the residents of Utah use up less than 8% of the water here in the state. The vast majority of it is being used for agricultural purposes. So when you take that into account, so why is it that we're using so much water for agricultural purposes as well, that's really wasting so much of our water? And I think that's a good mindset to have in terms of where are we wasting so much water? Why are we wasting it? And how can we change our ways to restore the lake? Because this is not a short-term, it's not going to be a short-term solution. And it doesn't just impact certain people. It impacts everybody who chooses to move here or live here. And there's a lot of reasons why the Great Salt Lake is worth saving. Number one, our very existence depends on it. In fact, let me close this screen here real quick. Our very existence does depend greatly on the Great Salt Lake, because if that lake dries up, it's been talked about in a lot of news articles, the lake bed itself can become airborne. There's a lot of pockets of that lake bed that have already dried up that are very prone to becoming airborne through dust. And there's a lot of naturally occurring arsenic in that soil and in that lake bed. So if this becomes a really consistent pattern and we have a lot of dust storms coming off of a dried up lake bed that's just west of the population areas here along the Wasatch Front, it could mean that we're going to be breathing in carcinogens and cancer causing materials out of that dust that would just make it completely uninhabitable here along the Wasatch Front. And let's see here. Heliski comments, airborne toxic sentiment is real. What he's trying to say is that sediment in the lake bed is real. It's something we have to be really concerned about. And on the topic of skiing, because you're obviously a skier as well, it's really important to talk about why we need this lake, because that lake also affects the entire climate here. As the air moves across the lake in the wintertime, it causes what's called lake effect snow. And to a great degree, the reason why we have so much snow in these mountains, including the powder, the greatest snow on earth that we've come to love in terms of skiing and snowboarding, is because of this lake and Utah Lake. As that air moves across the lake, the air gets a little bit warmer and therefore picks up some of that moisture. And then as soon as that air hits the mountain range and it has to climb in altitude, it dumps that snow right in the mountains. And it's that very water that preserves our way of life here and makes its way back to the Great Salt Lake. So it's this constant cycle that we have to be aware of. So not only is our way of life impacted, but our way of recreating can be impacted as well. We may not have that snow that we've come to love and grow, or love that we've grown to love, if it weren't for the Great Salt Lake. So when we go way back and why this place was settled to begin with in the 1800s, in 1847, the first settlers found their way into the Salt Lake Valley through Immigration Canyon and declared that this is the place. This is the place they want to call home, that they wanted to inhabit this place and build a new city out in the West. And at the time, it wasn't even part of the United States. This was Mexican territory. And as they came here to the Great Salt Lake, they discovered a really good opportunity to not only take advantage of the Great Salt Lake and the areas around it, but the mountain ranges to the east that provide the very water that would be necessary to build a community here, to make it possible for us to live here. And as that played out over many years in the 1800s, the Great Salt Lake was known as and became one of the cultural centers, or a resort, so to speak. It was kind of like the Coney Island of the West. If you look at these photos, let me share this screen with you. How do I do this? Obviously, I don't know how to do this. Let me stop that screen and share another one. One of these days, I'll figure out how to use this software really well. But here we have some pictures of the Saltaire. The Saltaire was the resort that everybody came to. And if I look through photos of Saltaire in the 1800s and into the 1900s, it's pretty amazing that not only was it a place where people would come from all over Utah, but they would come from all over the country and the world. It actually had the largest dance hall in the entire world at one point. And I'm trying to see if I can find a photo of that. Let's see here. And the Saltaire was a destination that people came from all over the world. You can see in this photo here, it was built right along the shoreline of the Great Salt Lake and was one of those places where people would come, and it would have thousands of people inside of this dance hall. In fact, here's a photo of the dance hall itself from the 1800s. You can see on the right-hand side of my screen here, this is the dance hall inside of Saltaire. They also built a massive roller coaster as well as so many other things. And people would come here to Saltaire, they would dance, they would have really big parties. They would swim in the Great Salt Lake, which the novelty of it is fun, but it wears off. If you've lived here your whole life, you may have done it once or twice, and that was enough for you. But ultimately, the reason why I bring this up is the Great Salt Lake was the centerpiece as to why people thought it was so interesting to come here to begin with, which included the people that settled this place. They settled here because this was it was an oddity that we have this massive saltwater lake here in the middle of what we kind of consider a desert. And to put this into perspective, the reason why the Great Salt Lake is salty to begin with is it has 4 main rivers that feed into the lake, but the water cannot leave. And so as that water just continually comes into the lake, it brings with it minerals and everything else, including salt that naturally occurs in nature and throughout the ecosystem, and it brings it into the Great Salt Lake, and the salinity level gets saltier and saltier as time goes on. And the Great Salt Lake, when healthy, is usually anywhere from 5 times to 15 times saltier, or sorry, percentage-wise, 5 to 15% salty, which is about 3.5 times to 4 times saltier than the ocean. And it's that salt that really impacts not only the Great Salt Lake, but the entire ecosystem. The Great Salt Lake is also a massive destination for migratory birds in North America. It's a stopping place, and it really impacts so much more than what we imagine typically. And so the history behind the Great Salt Lake, and thank you, Kendra, for sharing that. The history behind the Great Salt Lake is just as big of a part of the reason why we need to save it as what we're talking about today, and that's preserving our way of life here. So we've talked about just a little bit as to why we can't let the Great Salt Lake die. We can't let it dry up. And we kind of reached this tipping point just a few short years ago. It was 3 winters ago, now almost 4 winters ago, when we had the largest winter we've ever recorded here. It even surpassed that of 1983. And that was the preceding years to leading up to the fact that the Great Salt Lake was actually flooding. So up to that point, for so many years, the Great Salt Lake has been shrinking over the last few decades because we've been poor stewards of the water to the point where we haven't let enough water make its way to the Great Salt Lake. And because of that, it just kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Well, almost 4 years ago, we had the biggest winter on record with over 900 inches of snow at the ski resorts. And it filled up all of our reservoirs throughout the state for the most part, other than 2 big lakes that are the biggest lake in the West, which is the Great Salt Lake, which was what we're talking about, but also Lake Powell, which is in southern Utah. So Lake Powell and the Great Salt Lake are still in very poor condition in terms of how much more water we need to get those to get them full. But on the topic of the Great Salt Lake, it did make an impact. The Great Salt Lake rose quite a bit, but this is not the type of problem that can be solved with one amazing winter. This is something it's going to take a lot more impact and a lot more effort in terms of what everybody's doing to get this thing to get back into a position where we have a healthy lake. Heliski comments here, 75 feet of snow in Little Cottonwood, 50 feet in Park City. That was the most epic season we've ever seen. There were places at a cabin right above Alta and Brighton, which is up Big Cottonwood Canyon, where they measured 77 feet of snow. And that was the most epic season, like you mentioned, that we've ever seen here. And yet it only made a little dent in terms of how much water made its way to the Great Salt Lake. Now, luckily, a lot of things have been changing these last few years. In fact, just this last legislative session, there were 12 bills that went through, and each of those 12 bills are making meaningful efforts to restore the levels of the Great Salt Lake. But there's a lot more that needs to happen. We can't be lackadaisical about this. We have to be very intentional. We've got to find a lot of solutions as to what we can do to get water back into the Great Salt Lake. So I've broken this down into 3 categories. Number 1, what are the residents of Utah doing? Because here in Utah, the residents, we use less than 8% of the water, but it's still part of the equation. And most people, when they hear about the lack of water or lakes drying up, we immediately think, well, it's because of all the people that are moving here. It's all the people that live here. And while that is part of the equation, it's not the full picture. In fact, it's not even a big part of the picture. It does come into play, however, and with the population since 1986 going from 1.4 million people up to what we now have almost 3.6 million people in that time frame. As we project into as we look at our population forecast over the next couple of decades, we're going to exceed 5 million people. So how do we continue to grow without having the water that's necessary to make that happen? And if we let this lake dry up, we can't live here to begin with. So what's the point? And we need a lot of those epic years like we had a few years ago in order to make a meaningful impact quickly. But that's not likely. We can't rely solely on Mother Nature and the fortune that we might have in one season like we did a few years ago to help restore the lake. So the residents of Utah are part of the solution. How are we doing that? Well, a lot of the new communities, as well as the new developments, including the commercial areas, they're being more mindful about what plants are planted, because for some reason in the state of Utah, we've adopted this mentality that everybody needs to have a massive yard and it needs to be full of grass and lush green vegetation. And it doesn't make a lot of sense when you think about where we live. We live on the eastern edge of the Great Basin, which is the largest basin in the world. And this basin is dry, it's desert. And so to think that we have millions of people living here with lush green lawns just doesn't make sense. Now, with that said, we don't have to be like Arizona either. We don't have to have, xeriscaping and rocks everywhere. We can actually find some balance. And I think that comes in the form of finding plants and vegetation that work well with the natural environment, which is what a lot of these newer developments are doing, including the neighborhood where I live, which is called Daybreak. Daybreak's known for this. They've made meaningful choices in the vegetation of the common areas and the areas around the community to make sure that it's not using as much water as a thick lawn, for example. So this is part of the solution. How do we as residents better use the water that we've been given? Because here in the state of Utah, we waste more water than every other state in the country. In other words, the residents of Utah use more water per capita than every other state, which makes no sense. Water is a scarce resource here. Why are we using more than anywhere else? And to make that matter even worse, water in Utah is some of the cheapest water in the country. Now, you'll never have me talk about how we should probably make something more expensive. But in all honesty, if something is scarce, it should likely be more expensive. Therefore, it would be more painful to be wasteful with that resource, you would think, right? So for whatever reason, our water is too cheap, and therefore it's wasted way too much. It doesn't make any sense to me why we, A, have so much waste in terms of water, and B, why are we charging so little for it when it's such a scarce resource? Now, I'm not a proponent of raising prices, but we do need to have some meaningful impact as to how we manage the resource. So that's being mostly done through the new developments that are happening, but what do we do with the old ones, right? So how do we get that switch, that mindset to switch in terms of preserving and conserving water? The next thing that is a meaningful way that we can really impact the levels of the Great Salt Lake is through the government and what they're choosing to do. It's the House bills that were passed this last legislative session to not only commit to getting more water back to the Great Salt Lake, but to being better stewards of it, to doing studies, to making sure that we can understand what is going to happen when this dust becomes airborne. Why is it that we can't understand the impact of this? Because to me, at least, as a local Utahn living here my entire life, despite how big the Great Salt Lake is, it's almost like it's out of sight, out of mind, because we never go out there. We don't go wander out into the middle of the Great Salt Lake. And so if you've just got your head down and you're doing your daily routine, going to work and going home and doing your thing, it's kind of like off. It's not top of mind, but it needs to be. And so what the government needs to do is make meaningful change and impact so that we can inspire change, not only with the people of Utah, but the entities here as well that will help make some meaningful impact. The next thing that we really have to do is to solve the real problem, which to me is diversion. And we've got some comments here. Let's see here. Andrea out in Daybreak, my neighbor, she watches a lot of my videos. She comments all the time. My water here in Daybreak is not cheap, and I have no yard. This is true. Now, this is one of those things that's happening with newer developments. The water is getting more expensive, and the landscaping is minimal. So in Daybreak, for example, we have very small yards for the most part, and yet it can actually be quite expensive. Another comment, to also increase precipitation. Water in Utah is partially billed through property taxes. It's hidden, so a water bill is not fully reflective of what we pay for the water. This is true. Yeah, that's definitely part of the equation. There's a lot of ways that we can be more transparent in what the water actually costs us. And I think if we actually feel the full breadth of that, and it's not just in your property taxes, we might be more inclined to save water. But here's the thing. The residents of Utah use less than 8% of the water. They use less than 4% for indoor use, and they use less than 4% for outdoor use. So what are we going to do about it? So in my opinion, it's the other power. So we talk a lot about politicians. We talk about the people that are in power in the state of Utah. And that's not just politicians. That's business leaders, civic leaders. It's billionaires. It's people or entities that carry the most weight and the most power here in the state of Utah. And kind of at the top of the list, you'd put the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They recently donated 5,700 shares of water in perpetuity forever to go to the Great Salt Lake, which is a very meaningful and sizable amount of water. That's about 20,000 acre feet of water every year. So that's a lot of water that's been recommitted to the Great Salt Lake. But those are all just small parts of a bigger picture that we need to make meaningful differences to make sure that this actually gets restored. Other impactful entities or people or voices might be the top businesses in the state of Utah. It might be local leaders or people that have attention. It can't just be solely a responsibility of politicians, because we all like to complain about politicians, and no one's going to ever, hear from Governor Cox and think everybody's going to be on his side and make sure that we help him accomplish something. But if we can get local leaders on board to help create initiatives to make sure water is making its way to the Great Salt Lake, that's more impactful. Some other things I want to talk about in terms of, we've talked about the story behind the Great Salt Lake, why it's declined so much. Other things that are really inspiring to me is just on the ground projects. So we see a lot of projects taking place, and there's been funding, millions of dollars in funding going to these grant programs to help with wetland restoration, whether it be grant programs for enhancing wetlands at the Great Salt Lake, or to help retain the water and the habitat. That's part of the equation. Now, a lot of people hear about, things that might come from an environmentalist perspective, and they just kind of immediately push that off to the side, and they don't really give it a lot of credibility. But in this case, it absolutely plays into things, and it's another arrow in the quiver to help restore the Great Salt Lake, in my opinion. There's also been water reuse studies. So the Utah's Department of Environmental Quality looked at how wastewater reuse affects the lake levels as well. We see that happening. We see conservation measures. We see that the state of Utah issued drought emergency orders urging residents to slow the flow. This is a marketing campaign that we hear in Utah every single year, and it works. It's proven that it actually works. But just a few short years ago, prior to that biggest winter that we've had, it really made some big changes. We saw a lot of businesses that summer before stop watering their lawns. And I'm talking massive properties. I saw hospitals. I saw private businesses with massive pieces of property with tons of green grass, and they let it go and they let it die off. And they've since re-landscaped in a much more realistic way. And I think that's part of the equation as well, because commercially and industrial use and all of these things that we waste so much water here, we may as well find a method to restore more of that water in that regard as well. So the other thing I really wanted to talk about in terms of talking about the Great Salt Lake, I've shared some photos, I've shared some video of the Great Salt Lake, and I think all of that is well and fine. I think it's really impactful to see what's happening to the Great Salt Lake, just because, like I said earlier, if it's out of sight, it's pretty much out of mind. And so I think it's really helpful to see in person. I'm going to share one more thing here. Let's see here. Hold on one second. Whoops. Let's remove that. One of these days, I'm going to learn how to use this software. Let's see here. Share screen. So again, I just think it's really helpful to actually see what is happening here in the state. And for most people, this is the very thing that kind of opened their eyes to what's a bigger problem and what's actually happening, is just actually being able to see the time lapse of what's going on here. Let's see if I can turn this on. One of these days, let's see, why is this not working? Let's see here. There we go. I just think it's really impactful. That's the thing that's going to provide us a way of life here and a way to be able to stay here. So another question. This is a different question. Let's see here. Aren't the Steele and Lyman families related? This is true. How do you know that? I'm really curious. HD7747. That's funny that you say that. But yeah, this is why we need to save the Great Salt Lake. What can we do about it? It's all about knowing what is happening so that when those bills are passed or when those things come across in terms of what the politicians are doing or private entities are doing, that we can be on board with those things. And the public buy-in is a big part of it, because if we don't have the public buy-in, it's not going to make the impact that it would otherwise. So again, Great Salt Lake, it's super important that we fix this. I share a lot of videos here on my channel, and I share a lot of B-roll or video that I've captured of the Great Salt Lake with my drone. And as I fly my drone over the lake, it's pretty crazy. Had I been able to do that decades ago and had a drone back then, I'm sure it'd be really interesting to see the comparison. But in sharing these videos every week, I love sharing things that are impactful, not only for those that are living here, but those that are moving here. And so hopefully this is the type of content that really resonates with you and helps you. I've got a lot more videos planned every single week. I'll be doing these live videos. And then throughout the weeks, every week, I'll post a couple of other videos as well. And as always, my real estate team and I would love to be your real estate resource of choice. We're always here for you, whether you already live here and you're looking to make a move, buy, sell, whatever it is that you're trying to do, we're here for you. Reach out to us. And you can find our contact information in the description below, or you can book a video call with us in that link that you'll find in the pinned comment on this and every video. And until next week, see you later.